In reach or sight? Ooh, not right now. All right. Is everybody within sight of a handout? Okay, excellent. Everybody within sight of a Bible? Okay. Anybody using the Burgundy Bibles? Want to tell me what page we're on?
785.
785. Thank you, Jim. So, the day has arrived you've all been waiting for. We're finally to Habbakuk. Woo! Right?
Yes, please.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So how many people is Habbakuk your favorite book of the Bible? How many people, like Owen and Aaron, are still not 100% sure how we pronounce it? Yeah. So actually, that's funny. That's actually where I'm going to start, is we don't know how to pronounce Habbakuk because we don't know. Alex, what do you got?
You should just make it a practical tool.
Yes.
Or if you have it, if you don't, it's fine.
Yes.
Do you have a system, a memory system where you're like giants eat peas and carrots?
Oh, yes. Oh, I am so glad you asked this. I am so glad you asked this because we do require the confirmands. You know where this is going now, don't you? I told you last night. With the confirmands, we do. We use these mnemonic devices, and every other year we do the Bible. We alternate. 1 year is Bible, 1 year is catechism. And I let the confirmands come up with a mnemonic sentence to try to memorize the names. And one of them has so topped all of the others that we've stuck with this one now for, I think, 6 years. Because you got to meet Jeremy last night. He was here at the game night. It was when he was here as he was taking the class, but he was also a classroom helper because he was a later catechist and or confirmand. And so this is the sentence for Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. This just kills me. He just absolutely obliterated Jeremy's mom. Now his zebras have 0 mothers. Jeremy's mom. Now his zebras have 0 mothers. Yep, that's 12 words, and that is the letters of Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So yes, I am so glad you asked me if I had a mnemonic device. He just absolutely obliterated Jeremy's mom. Now his zebras have 0 mothers. Yeah, that year, that class was really good because they also, for the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they did go eat Legos, not donuts. Like that one sticks too. They were just, they had some skills. Yeah, there you go. So, Habakkuk. Now, Owen and Aaron had asked, how do we pronounce it? Habakkuk or Habbakuk? Because people say both. And the answer is, we don't know. Because, interestingly enough, of all of the prophets, like I said, Hebrew names are usually a sentence, or every once in a while you'll get a name that's also a noun. Rachel means dove. That sort of thing. And interestingly enough, Habakkuk, we're really not 100% sure. It's related to a couple of different things, and you can really go down an internet rabbit hole on this one if you want to research the name Habakkuk. It is related to the word embrace, and so that seems to be, I think, maybe the likeliest one, because it's also related to the word for emptiness, which would be an interesting thing to name. There was one, it was a very interesting essay, but it seemed kind of flighty, who was trying to say that it was supposed to mean both, as embrace emptiness, which sounded rather goth or emo to me, and probably not very Habakkuk-y. So I wasn't really buying that one. But at any rate, we're not 100% sure. Usually it's quite clear what it means. Habakkuk, we're not 100% sure. As I said, it really doesn't tend to have a whole lot to do with the message, although every once in a while, remember Micah liked all the puns, and one of Micah's greatest verses is, who is a God like God? What does Micah mean? Who is like the Lord? So Micah was big on puns. This, by the way, good to know when we're doing room selection up in heaven. If you're into puns, try to find Micah's section. But if you're not, maybe it's steered toward maybe Habakkuk. He seems, All right. So what is great about Habakkuk is a number of things. And actually, I tease a little bit, but Habakkuk really is a study of why does God allow evil. And that, to me, is just one of the most fascinating topics you could deal with. The entire book of Job is a reflection on that topic. But here's what Habakkuk's got going over the book of Job for busy people. Habakkuk is only 3 chapters. So we're going to get to go through every verse today, and we should be able to do so in a timely fashion and go through Habakkuk. And it is why I do kind of wonder if it maybe means embrace, because we're going to see the way that God's embrace is still part of how we deal with darkness and difficult things. So Habakkuk, you see the way I'm going to split it up. We're going to do verses 1 through 11 first, which is kind of the first argument. We're going to have Habakkuk 1:12 through 2:3, which is kind of another argument. Then we're going to hear God's promise in the remaining portion of Habakkuk 2, and then there's a psalm in Habakkuk 3. So, would somebody be willing to start us off with reading, starting with verse 1, chapter 1? You don't have to go all the way to 11, although you are welcome to if you wish. If you want to pause somewhere and hand off to somebody else, that is also fine. Somebody want to start us off, Habakkuk 1:1?
I'll do it.
All right, thank you, Brenda.
I'm trying to do it.
Yeah.
Habakkuk's complaint. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted.
Let's actually pause there, because I misspoke. We're going to read 1 through 4, then we're going to do 5 through 11. So pausing there, nicely read. So what's the tone here of these verses that we've just read? You were to say, what's the tone?
Impatience.
Okay, impatience, right? How long?
Lament.
Lament is definitely happening. If you were to do this in performative theater, what tone of voice would you be taking? Elijah?
So this is a good question. It sounds like he's obviously complaining, but then why does it say the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw? Is he seeing his own complaint somehow?
So it does, excellent question, because verse 1, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw, and then you have Habakkuk's complaint. The way that I laid this out here, an argument, another argument, it kind of takes on the form of almost, God bless you, almost the form of like a courtroom drama. You have demands or complaints being presented and then responded to. So think of this almost as like a legal argument. So then the question is, does Habakkuk sort of have a vision that he's able to be in this sort of courtroom setting? We're not really, nothing is described for us about what it would look like, where Habakkuk can be voicing these complaints himself? Or is he sort of seeing a dialogue happening in which he is one of the characters and God is one of the characters? And one of the things to keep in mind, I am sure we have all had the experience of having a dream where sometimes your part is like first person and you're seeing what you're seeing and everything, and then other times you're a character and you're almost watching yourself be a character in the dream, right? Visions can take on some dream-like qualities. So I can't answer for sure. Is this a first-person view, or is this is Habakkuk viewing himself having this dialogue with God? The content really doesn't change by where we would land on that. It's a totally valid question to which I really can't provide an answer. This is the oracle that he saw. Interestingly enough, if that wasn't what the first verse said, we would have thought this is basically just like a psalm. And it ends literally with a psalm. So it's interesting that it's called an oracle that the prophet saw. Does make me think maybe a little more of this, he's watching the dialogue between himself and God. No way to say for certain. Any other thoughts on that, though? It's an excellent question. All right, so let's get to the content then, verses 2 through 4. So if you were watching this, what kind of tone does Habakkuk have as he's addressing God? Sounds fairly accusatory to me, doesn't it? I mean, this is a demand. It says Habakkuk complaint, but it really sounds like a demand for an answer. How long shall I cry for help and you don't hear? Cry to you violence, you won't save. Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed. Justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous. So justice goes forth. Perverted, which is worse than no justice going forth at all, right? False justice is worse than no justice. At least if there's been no judgment, you could await a judgment. But if there's been a false judgment, what recourse is there? You're certainly in a worse situation. So the tone, definitely accusatory. The content, how would you summarize these first few verses?
I was the wrong writer.
Yeah, why is the wrong not righted? Why is God letting this transpire? Why aren't you acting? Would seem to be the, yep. Okay, so, and what's he referring to? What are the wrongs that are taking place? Now here, keep a finger, and we're going to turn back to 2 Kings, because we do know when he was prophesying. I didn't make mention of it. 605 BC. So he's prophesying roughly 20 years before the southern kingdom of Judah falls, but he's already more than 100 years after the northern kingdom has fallen. Remember, northern kingdom of Israel falls 722 to Assyria. Southern kingdom's going to fall in 586. That means he overlaps very much with Jeremiah, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because Jeremiah's job was to tell the people of Jerusalem, even though you've been the chosen city, you have totally punted on all of your responsibilities. God's going to be destroying you, essentially because you've destroyed what his testimony was supposed to be on earth. That wasn't what they wanted to hear at all. So turning back to 2 Kings 23. Did anybody get it already? I'm almost there. It's page 330 if you want to keep, if you have the maroon Bibles here. We're going to start with verse 23. I want to make sure that I put the right reference here, because that's an odd place to break. It's a very odd place to break. Hold on. I think it's a typo. Well, except it's at the right time. Jerusalem. So let me just see what verses I was intending to type. My apologies. Okay, I think, yeah. All right, we can start with 23. I think maybe I see what I was thinking there. All right. First, 2 Kings 23:23. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. I think maybe I meant to start at 24. Moreover, Josiah put away the mediums and the necromancers and the household gods and the idols, all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and all his soul and all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So praising very much the faithful King Josiah, one of the few faithful kings that, God bless you, that Judah ever had. And as we're seeing here, praised as the best of all of Judah's kings. Verse 26, though, still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city that I've chosen, Jerusalem, the house of which I said, my name shall be there. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Judah? In his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him. So here's Josiah's downfall as he tried to play politics, which was not a good plan. Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo, and as soon as he saw him, his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo. By the way, this is where we get Armageddon from, by the way. Har Megiddo is the mountain of Megiddo. So Armageddon and Har Megiddo are the same thing. So his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem, buried him in his own tomb. The people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him, made him the king in his father's place. But then look what happens. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign. He only reigned 3 months. We get his mother's name. Verse 32, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah in the lands of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem, laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Then Pharaoh Necho met Eliakim, the son of Josiah, so the king's brother becomes the king, in the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there, etc., etc. So you can see what we're at. We don't need to read all that I had marked off here. But where we're at here is it's all coming apart now. Yep, there's corruption. We had a good king. We kind of had our last gasp, and then this is it. And they're only lasting for months at a time. They're flailing to make political or military alignments, but God has said that's it. We're end of the road here as far as Jerusalem and Judah go. All right, so that's what he's referring to. Whether he's talking about the corruption of his own kings, which, as we see, is absolutely the case once Josiah dies, or the viciousness of whether it's Pharaoh Necho, or then it's going to be Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon, the evil of those who are attacking. Where's a righteous person supposed to turn? My king's evil. He's being conquered by kings that are more evil. Who do we cheer for here? I'm not going to make any Super Bowl references whatsoever. So, can you relate to these emotions? These emotions of why is evil being allowed to thrive? Why are we just going from bad to worse? Is that a relatable feeling? Yeah, absolutely. This idea of having to explain, why does God allow for evil? Why does God allow for us to suffer? Why doesn't he simply act? And that's what the rest of this is going to be a reflection on. So, well, it'd be interesting to start to discuss already. Why don't we let Habakkuk's text kind of shape that conversation? So we're going to see the Lord's answer. We've had Habakkuk's complaint. We're now going to see the Lord's answer. Now, Brenda, I cut you off. Were you eagerly looking forward to reading the next verses?
I could make an attempt at it.
Okay, because I would hate to disappoint you if you're just...
Since
We're a small crew. All right, excellent. Appreciate it. 5 through 11, Brenda's got us. Habakkuk 1.
Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forwards. They gather captives like sands. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, filthy men whose own might is their God.
All right, there you go. So this is the Lord's answer. Habakkuk's complaint was, why are you allowing evil to flourish and thrive? And what's God's answer here? And is this a cheering response or
Raising
not
up
so
a
much?
Bigger evil.
Yeah. You think this is bad. You ain't seen nothing yet, right? I got a worse evil for you. Yeah. Is that a cheering response from God? Does not feel like it. No, it's like, is this supposed to be good news? Chaldeans, by the way, is just another name for Babylonians. Those are interchangeable. Ur of the Chaldees gets mentioned a number of times, and that's Babylon. So just different names. Remember that these are multilingual places we're talking about. A lot of different languages, so a lot of different names are being used, not to get distracted by that. All right, so yeah, and then the question here also, is this response on God's behalf unfair? God says, I'm bringing the Chaldeans, they're going to be this conquering army. By the way, some of this language sounds very, very much like we just saw in Micah with the conquering army of the Assyrians coming to conquer Israel in the north. So there's very similar language being used. Is this an unfair response on God's part to bring the Chaldeans and to totally wipe out Judah? Is God being mean or unfair in any way? Why is he doing it? Because of hundreds and hundreds of years of them rejecting God's word. And as we saw, even when they had Josiah, who loved the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength, right, and did everything he could to read from the law and to teach the law to the people, right afterwards, his own son leads them right back into the same idolatry that they had turned away from. Right back into the sty, right? So get them out, clean them all up, jump right back into the mud. That's exactly what the Israelites have done throughout. The Judeans, at this point, that's all that's left, have done throughout. Even when they get a faithful king, like Hezekiah was, like Josiah was, as soon as that one dies, bam, right back into the mire. Christy, you had a hand up.
It's a little bit of a side. You know,
That's fine.
In verse 11, when it says, "Guilt and his own might is their God,"
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really
Yeah.
fascinating because for two things. First of all, most of the other nations, when they talk about other gods and that sort of thing, they're talking about actual like gods.
Right, like Molech or Marduk or any of the other gods. Yep.
And so the fact that, because we as humans
So much more relatable here. When it says their own might is their God, obviously that's not being portrayed as being a good thing. And yet we as a culture, we do tend to worship strength, both physical strength, willpower, that sort of thing. And that's not a good outcome when humans are trusting themselves as gods. You can go ahead and read the book of Judges if it turns out well, because every chapter ends with, and each one did what was right in his own sight. I can tell you that's not good. So we've got this army coming. So Habakkuk complains, so how long are you going to let this evil go on? And God says, not much longer, but because he's going to completely wipe out his people at the hands of an even more evil army. So is it an unfair response based on what the Judeans have been doing for hundreds of years? Well, no, this is justice, right? This is what God had been warning. Remember, we did the Deuteronomy study, boy, that's got to be a year ago now, but we did that study, and it kept saying, when you enter the promised land, if you're faithful, I'll bless you, but if you're unfaithful, then I'm going to have to wipe you out. So God has been warning this for hundreds of years throughout, before they even went through the period of the judges. God had been warning this. So God has warned and has warned and has warned and has warned, and finally, he's acting. I don't think when that's the case, you can say it's unfair or unjust, as harsh as it is to see a wicked nation or wicked nation's army conquering God's chosen people. All right, so is this a desirable outcome from the standpoint of Habakkuk? No, but I also don't see what other outcome there could be, right? I mean, in some ways, like let me put it this way. I didn't put it in one of the apply it straight to us tones, but do you long for the day of the Lord's judgment? Complicated answer, isn't it? I mean, no, and yes, right? We do want God to judge the wicked. We don't, I mean, how long is implying it's been too long? How about just put an end to this? And God says, okay, I'll put an end to it. And here's how I'm going to put an end to it. Helen, was that a hand or just a stretch? All right, so it's complicated. Is this what Habakkuk desires or not? Well, hopefully he doesn't desire the decimation and destruction of his people, but at the same time, he does desire justice, and this is justice. So, a little complicated, and we can see the way that that would tie to our own look toward the Lord, the day of the Lord's judgment. All right, now let's move on. We have Habakkuk's second complaint, and then we're also going to have the responses. So this is Habakkuk 1:12 through 2:1. Would somebody be willing to read that? And I won't interrupt you. I'll let you get in the flow. I threw off Brenda's flow, but Christy's got it.
Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? You shall not die. The Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of pure eyes and to see evil, and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind a provision to see, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his drag net. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his drag net. But by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly kill the nations forever?
Yep.
I will take my stand at my watchpost, station myself on his wall, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my
Okay, so this we can kind of break up a little bit before I even get to the bullet point questions there. But I will say, now what's the tone? The tone before was kind of accusatory, kind of, yep, complaint is not unfair. What about now? Starts a little different, at least. At first, what's that?
The end stands out to me
Okay.
is he's still kind of saying like, I get it, but are you just gonna do this forever?
Right.
How does this end?
Yeah.
I'll be at my post.
Yeah. What's the end game? I'll be waiting over here. Let me know. I'll be listening. Yep. Stand by. Elijah.
Excuse me if I'm just being a bit slow here, but
It's a complicated
that mixed
section.
metaphor
Yeah.
with the net is very confusing.
Yeah. So we're going to need to pull that apart bit by bit. So let's start at verse 12, all of 12, and then the beginning of 13. Seem pretty straightforward. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment. You, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot do wrong. So that all seems to kind of flow. Go ahead, Christy.
So what's interesting to me is we shall not die. That kind of stuck out to me because his tone in my ears kind of shifted a little bit from the first is kind of like this despair.
Right.
Accusatory. And now it's almost like, all right, I'm thankful that we're still alive.
Right.
So maybe God's answer kind of gave him a little more perspective. And also just the faith that he knows God's not going to completely wipe him out.
Yes, so I think we have, at least in verse 12, verse 13 is where it gets really confusing because it seems like there's a pivot happening and I can't quite say with confidence exactly where and what that pivot is. But verse 12 seems very clear, which seems to be Habakkuk recognizing God has said he will wipe out his people as a nation, but he will preserve his people. There will be a remnant that he will preserve and he will restore. And this is something God has been very clear. Again, before they even entered the promised land, God had said, this is what's going to happen. So I do wonder to some degree if the Lord's answer has actually calmed Habakkuk's concern, like, oh, right, there was going to be this reckoning, but it wouldn't totally wreck us. We would still have a remnant, so we will still survive. So is that sort of his response or his trust? We're not going to die because you are from everlasting. You can't change your promises.
It's the switch in language to sort of acknowledging that the Lord has ordained this as judgment, has established this as reproof. I was thinking of, I don't remember where it is, where the Lord is addressing the congregation at large and says, you can have the plague, you can have your enemies attack you, you can have, and they picked the shortest possible one where he just wipes a bunch of them out, and then it just moves on. That's kind of like what it feels like here.
Yeah.
They've picked the least worst option.
Least worst, yeah. Well, and it definitely, I mean, we've known for a long time judgment is going to have to come. Here it comes. And I almost feel like, to me, the parallel seems more like, do you remember when King David had been inappropriate with Bathsheba, right? And then the prophet Nathan had come to call him to account for it and had said, because of this, the child would die. And David immediately goes into sackcloth and ashes and is praying that God would spare the life of the child. And then the child, indeed, does die, and the servants are afraid to go tell David because he's been so distraught about the possible death of the child. But then once they go in and tell him that the child is dead, he takes off the sackcloth and ashes, he takes a bath, he puts oil in his hair, he puts on his nice clothes, and he goes back to his duties. And they're like, what just happened? And he said, well, while the child was still alive, I was praying that perhaps God would relent in the judgment that he had warned. But now that the judgment, which is a just judgment, has come, I need to accept what God has done. I feel like maybe that kind of turn is happening in Habakkuk in verse 12, where at the beginning it's like, man, this is just going on forever, and it's just wickedness versus wickedness, and how long is this going to go on? And God says, well, actually, Babylon's about to wipe out the leadership of Judah. I'm not going to let this go on forever. Which then frees Habakkuk, now knowing the way that this is going to end, to say, all right, well, now I rely on your promise that you're not going to completely wipe us out, that we shall still be preserved as your people. Here's where I think the weird pivot happens, and I can only assume, if I'm correct, that it would have been easier to spot for the original listeners and the original readers than it is for us. I think that once it talks about you who are of purer eyes than to see evil, who cannot look at wrong, I think this is being said very, very tongue-in-cheek, very, very ironically, and it's not being said to God. I think it's being said to human rulers. That you are so pure you can't even look at evil. You who are so pure, you can't even look at wrong. Well, check out. You remaining silent now when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You're the one who make mankind like the fish of the sea or crawling things that have no ruler. You bring them up with a hook, you drag them out, and then you worship the net, which is this wonderful, the prophets can get very ironic and very comical. So you cast a net into the sea, you bring up all these fish, you're rich because of the fish, and instead of praising the God who made the fish, you praise the net. And you make sacrifices and offerings to the net. Which actually, this by itself, if it weren't couched in some of the other confusing stuff, would really preach. Because how often do we as human beings devise our schemes to make things happen, and then when we succeed, solely because of God's goodness to us, we praise the scheme that made it happen instead of the God who made it happen. So we end up offering sacrifices to our fish net instead of to the God who made the fish. And so I think that what's happened is at the beginning of verse 13, he has pivoted from talking to the Lord which has finished with 12, to an indictment against the earthly rulers who are acting like someone who would catch fish and then worship the net. That to me makes it then all hold together, and I can only hope that maybe that pivot in the tone or the language would have been more obvious perhaps to the original readers. I'm open to other possibilities, but it's the only way I can really make it make sense, because how does it make sense that God ends up worshiping the net? So I'm not 100% sure. However, let me, in fairness, give the other view here. Is this Habakkuk? If it is, it's Habakkuk being very cheeky. But is this Habakkuk warning God, well, don't fall in love with the Babylonians. You know, if they're the ones that you're using to do your will now, don't fall in love with them. If they're the net that you're using to harvest all the wicked out of the earth, please don't fall in love with them. Remember who we are, because then that would make, at 17, it gets confusing if you go with my other theory. Because then he says, is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? So you got one or the other. Either he has shifted in verse 13 to talking ironically to the earthly leaders, which I'm a little more comfortable with, or he's still talking to God and very much taking on an accusatory tone that if God just allows the Babylonians to go unchecked, that God would be as foolish as somebody who ended up worshiping a fish net. It could be that one too. I can admit this part is a little confusing to me. I'm not 100% sure. Go ahead, Christy, make it clear.
Well, I was wondering, it doesn't actually say anywhere that he's worshiping his net, does it?
It says he brings them up with a hook, he drags them out with his net, he gathers them in his dragnet, he rejoices and is glad. Verse 16, then he sacrifices to his net, makes offerings to his dragnet.
So that's interesting because in their, the Jewish culture, God, they have to sacrifice to him.
Right.
And so maybe he is sacrificing his people to the net of the Chaldeans in order to save the few that remain. So his offering is the sacrifice of the Israelites.
Okay, so the sacrifice of the wicked Israelites, Judeans, would be why he's able to then purify his nation.
Right.
But the complaint, okay, I mean, I can see this, the complaint on Habakkuk's part is, well, don't fall in love with the net.
Right, if you're going with that,
Right.
you can see where the sacrifice and offerings that he's putting in that cause the people that he's also trying to save.
Interesting. Okay, I could go with this. Elijah, what do you got?
Well, I know it's not the most scholarly or necessarily accurate version, but the King James version is definitely more historic. So I
Yep.
thought I'd take a look at.
Go ahead.
And in that it says, and makest, starting at 13.
Yep.
Thou art with pure eyes that to behold evil, and canst not look upon iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he.
Yep.
And makest men as the fishes of the sea, as the creeping things that have no ruler over them. They take up all of them with the ankle. They catch them in their net and gather them with their drag. So it switches from thy and thou for God, and then they for the man. I think it supports what you were saying.
Okay.
Originally.
Well, that what this is highlighting to me is I didn't quite do enough homework. So we'll see if I can come up with some more answers for next week and see if there's anything in the language itself that helps to clear it up. However, what I do think, regardless of this, this is a contention between Habakkuk and God, right? That's what he's either observing or participating in, depending on how we understand verse 1. And so the idea that he would make some accusation, when I was prepping this, I thought, no, it can't be that. But now that I'm looking at it, and some of these comments are making me think, well, it could be Habakkuk sort of challenging God or making demands of God. That certainly would fit with the tone from the beginning of the chapter. And it sort of would make sense, and Alex, you pointed this out already, of the way it ends. All right, I'm going to take my stand. I'm going to watch. I'm going to see what you're going to do. And it's sort of like, all right, God, I'm challenging you, and I'm going to see how you respond to this challenge. Which, again, pretty gutsy move on Habakkuk's part, if that's what's taking place. But it could indeed be what's taking place. I'm looking out to see what he's going to say, and then what I'll answer in regards to what my complaint was. Regardless of where we land on some of these specifics, and the imagery does make it a little bit challenging, at least at first read, regardless of where we land, we can be very clear this is a tussle between man and God. We've got a man demanding of God answers, but not necessarily liking the answers that he's hearing from God. So he made his demand, God made his answer. This is the response, which gets a little messier. Regardless of where we land on how we interpret it, it gets a little messier. And now he's saying, all right, I'm waiting to hear what the response is going to be. So at least, if nothing else, I've accomplished making you feel also that tension and desire to now hear the suspense. All right, so what's God going to say to this? All right, so let's carry on there, chapter 2, picking up with verse 2, and I'm just going to read to verse 4. The Lord answered me. By the way, I think this is really kind of the center of all of the book of Habakkuk. The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. So picture like a messenger now taking the tablets so that he can read and announce this message that's coming. Not like he's going to read it and run away. Write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It's not upright within him. But the righteous shall live by his faith. This is really the center of the argument. And part of why I'm sure that it's the center of the argument is it's very similar to the answer Job gets after 30-some chapters of reflecting and messiness, trying to figure out why does God allow suffering, is this idea that God knows the answer. We await it in faith. It's one of the things with the book of Job, which is a sidetrack. Obviously, it's not what we're studying today, but in the book of Job, we find out at the very beginning what's happening from a heavenly standpoint. Satan is asking permission to tempt Job, and God, within boundaries, first lets him take all of Job's possessions, then lets him take all of Job's health, as long as he doesn't take Job's life. We know that answer. The rest of the chapters are all Job and his friends wrestling with, why is this happening? Basically, the three friends saying, you must have sinned in order to deserve this, and Job saying, not guilty. This is God being unjust, which is interesting because that's not also correct. This is Satan, and God has allowed Satan to act in this way. And then at the end, when God finally answers, what answer does he give Job? Do you remember?
God.
Are you God? Yeah, I don't answer to you. Were you there when I made the seas? Were you there when I made the Leviathan? Were you there? And what's Job's response? Because I think at that point I would have been pretty cranked up. I would have been ready with some choice words for God at that point. And what's Job's response? You're right. Yep, I'm good. I talked out of turn. You're God. I'm not. You can do what you wish to do. I trust you. This seems very much of a piece with that. What's God's answer to this complaint about the wickedness of Judah and then the wickedness of Babylon, who are going to correct Judah and even protect? Now I think I'm coming around to this idea, Habakkuk's potential accusation that God would end up honoring the net that he's using to punish Judah. And what does God say? Wait for it, man. This is not done yet. Wait for it. We're going to write this down. We're going to come back to this. The vision is still awaiting its appointed time. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. His soul is puffed up within him. It's not upright. The righteous shall live by his faith. So this, I think, is very much the central message of Habakkuk, which would make it then the central message to us when we're wondering, why does God allow evil to persist? Wait. It's not done yet. Wait till you... How many of you have, in the middle of a movie that a friend has recommended to you, thought, why on earth am I watching this movie? And the friend says, wait. Wait till you see how it ends. Right? Yes, it's awful right now, but wait, it's worth it. Right? That's us. We're still in the middle of this plot. Right? We're still, and we don't know. We can't see from our perspective where it's going. What's God's answer to Job? I'm in charge. You're not. Let this play out. Which is interesting because there's a perfectly understandable answer that God, for some reason not known to us, doesn't choose to give to Job. Here again, we have to assume there is a perfectly good answer to the accusation. Wait for it. When you see it, you'll get it. You just don't get it yet. And I honestly, even as I'm reading this, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that answer. Now, maybe that's because it's not my city being threatened and it's not my family who might lose their lives. But nevertheless, that seems to be God's answer. Let's carry on here. Although, I would say this, what relationship, I don't love that language usually because it can get really squishy, but how would you typify the relationship between God and Habakkuk based on this exchange that's happening so far? What kind of relationship has to exist in order for this kind of exchange to take place?
Friendship.
What's that?
A friendship.
almost a friendship. There's certainly a closeness anyway. Elijah.
I think there's there's sort of a trust in Habakkuk here, because if he was, I mean, for one thing, he's talking to God, which implies he knows God can do something about this.
Okay.
And also there's a trust that, well, he's being a little saucy, and
Yeah.
he's trusting that
Saucy, I
God's
like
not just
that.
gonna like wipe him
Yeah.
off the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Press the zap Habakkuk button,
Yeah.
right? Which he knows is right there on the
Yeah.
board. Yeah, right? So, yes, I think from Habakkuk toward God, there is a trust that, A, you could be doing something about this. You don't complain to a God about something that he can't do, right? So he believes God could do something, so there's a faith base there. There's also at least enough trust to think God will listen to this complaint. And I think sometimes maybe we as parents forget when our kids complain to us that could be a reflection of trust as well. They believe that we're going to care. We need to show that we care, even if their complaint isn't something that moves the needle a whole lot for us, or isn't going to result in whatever change they're wanting to have happen. But the fact that they feel that they can come to us with that complaint, that means something. Habakkuk feels that he can come to God with complaint. And if collectively we're kind of arriving at this idea that 13 through 17 is almost an accusation, he feels he can even accuse God, and that God will respond faithfully. And we do indeed see that that's what happens. So this is part of what I love, and we had been talking about prayer after last week's session, but this is part of what I love about the biblical examples of prayer, is that it's pretty unedited. You can go to God with whatever you're thinking. Now, partly that's because he can already hear what you're thinking anyway, so I don't know who you think you're fooling by not saying it, but you can go to God with whatever you're feeling, with whatever you're thinking. He's a big boy. He can take it, and he wants that dialogue. That's why I use the language of relationship here. God is able to have a dialogue here with Habakkuk. And even if Habakkuk is getting a little saucy, a little cheeky, a little uppity, God listens and he still responds. He'll rebuke when he needs to also. But his final answer is wait. You just don't know the end of the story yet. So just sit tight. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
And maybe it is happening just in a way that it's hard for me to see. But one of the questions here, and concerning the problem of, I guess, of evil or why God allowed what happened. Habakkuk is not engaging God from the standpoint of like the Israelites, Judah is being who you created them to be. I guess that is, because that seems to be where I run into conflict with my children on this topic of evil.
Yep.
And their sinful nature.
Yep. God made them so that they could sin. Now he's mad at them for sinning.
Yeah.
Right.
And ordained that they would, in his sovereignty, in this whole kind of like really complicated challenge of
Yep.
God's sovereignty, our agency and choice and responsibility and things along those lines. So, I don't know, what are your thoughts there? That's obviously
Yeah, no, there's a lot, and it's a whole, field.
Yeah.
But I think there is a difference, for starters, there's a difference between foreknowledge and causing something to happen.
Sure.
So if you offer a kid, you can have ice cream for dinner or you can have broccoli, you'd know which one most kids, and you certainly would know who would be the exception too. So you know beforehand what they're gonna pick. You didn't make them pick that, even though you knew what they would pick. So there is a difference between foreknowledge and causing something to happen. However, it does get to, all right, so if God was going to punish sin, why didn't he just create us so that we couldn't, right? And we never get, I don't feel like in Scripture we ever get a full and robust answer to that question, which I think leaves us very much in Habakkuk's spot or Job's spot, which is, I gotta recognize I'm not God, and I gotta recognize this plot is not completed. And I do then also lean from that standpoint on when St. Paul says, we consider that the weight of glory that awaits us is not even worth comparing to our light and momentary suffering. So, and light and momentary and the weight of glory very much creates an image of a scale, where we feel like if we put all of our suffering on the scale, it's just gonna drop to the ground, and what's God doing over here? God's saying, no, you've got it exactly backwards. When you see what I've got in store for you, you're gonna recognize that there was no point even putting these things in the scale, right? I mean, it'd be like having, one of those little gram measuring things. Did we all do that in school, where you had the little measuring things in the balance or whatever, and they had those little tiny blocks, right? So imagine if you had the little tiny block to measure the 1 gram thing, and then you had like a Ford Raptor. It's probably not an experiment. We need to actually do the experiment to figure out which one is heavier, right? And that's sort of the way that God is talking about this. Once it looks like our suffering, which is this little gram, is this huge thing, and how could God possibly explain that? He's like, wait till you see what I've got coming, because it won't even compare. It's not even worth doing the experiment. However, that does leave us in the middle, and that is a place of trust. That is a place of faith, trusting that somehow the story that he's allowed is even better than if it hadn't taken place. I think there are a couple other ways, and we've had this in Ask Anything classes, so this will be a repeat for some of you, but there are a couple of ways we can kind of crack that nut open just a little bit. Like sometimes, this is one that kids ask a lot too, so I'll often use the example, I hope it's not too juvenile, of the difference between a stuffed animal and an actual pet. Because the stuffed animal will always be exactly where you put it, will always do exactly what you want it to do, because you're making it do that. But the flip side is a stuffed animal, other than in the very robust imagination of children, really can't love you back. Whereas a pet does not always do what it's supposed to do, doesn't always love you back, but then when it does, it means something very different than what the stuffed animal is able to give you. So I don't know if that's the answer. What I just kind of like about it is even my little pea-sized human brain can start to understand, all right, there's a difference between a voluntary decision to love and an automated, forced situation of love, such that you really can't call the first one. A kid can love a stuffed animal. Fictional stories notwithstanding, a stuffed animal really can't love a kid back, right? But an animal can. And I think to some degree, were God to have created us so that we could not reject him, we'd be more akin to the stuffed animal. Sure. And God created us so that we could reject him, which creates a situation more akin to an actual animal. Yeah. I don't know if that is, God might be up there. Every time I use that, I say, Rob, please, not the stuffed animal story again. Right?
Zap Rob.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the Zap Rob button could be hovering right now. But that's why I always couch it and say, all right, maybe my human brain can sort of understand why that would maybe make some sense. Maybe it's a different explanation than that, but we can start to understand why creating the possibility of rejection makes the love matter more than it could have without the possibility of rejection. So that's kind of the question of evil, why human beings were allowed to rebel against God. That kind of starts that conversation. It's a bigger conversation than that. Let's take a look at a couple of things that God says, because it feels like he takes a right-hand turn. I want to get us on the road. Interestingly, this feels very much like a left turn to me. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who's never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he never has enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. So that's talking about wine. No idea why it felt like God felt the need to talk about wine right away. Other than what I will note is last week we unexpectedly started talking about wine also. Do you remember? And those who were drinking too much. And so it would seem that alcohol was part of Judah's problem by this point. It's interesting. It never, comes out and says when it's listing Judah's unfaithfulnesses, their drunkenness. However, drunkenness keeps getting addressed by the prophets. So I'm thinking drunkenness is probably a problem in Judah by this time. But going on, what he immediately does then is turn his eyes to the woe that will be coming on the Chaldeans as well. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him? Woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, and for how long loads himself with pledges? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoiled for them, because you've plundered many nations, etc., etc. So it's going to go on and talk about verse 15. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. So we got the drinking thing again. Verse 17, the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them, the blood of man and violence to the earth, the cities and all who dwell in them, a rebuke against idols. And then verse 20, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So the chaos, the agent of chaos, which was Babylon, will itself be chaotically destroyed. But here's God just chilling in his temple. This is God he's at peace here. This doesn't concern him in the least. And then it ends with, I wanted to point out a couple of things. So verse 5 warns about wine. Verse 15, woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. Verse 18 warns against idolatry. So we've got the debauchery and we've got idolatry. Those are two things that show up frequently as cause for rebuke. It would seem that they are rampant in both the conquered and the conqueror. And in neither place is it something that God upholds or tolerates. And then we get this final prayer that ends. And why don't I just read this and we'll call it quits, other than any comments people want to make. A prayer of Habbakuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. We have no idea what Shigionoth is. It's probably a tune name, the same way that our in the hymnal, you can look in the hymnal and each of our tunes has a name. So we started with bum 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 bum, which is called Agincourt. That's just the name of that tune. Is that right? Yeah, it's Agincourt, right? The one we started with today, Orianaran? I think so. We could look it up. It's all Oteo Gracia? Okay. So, see, you can always ask an organist, and they know the tune names, because they have to look up their preludes and their postludes and everything based on the tune name, which could be set to different words. So we know something by, like, Amazing Grace or How Great Thou Art. Organists almost always know it by the tune name instead. This is probably a tune name. So these are the words, the lyrics. When you sing it, you should sing it to the tune that would have been known as Shigionoth, whatever that means. And there are a bunch of psalms that also have the similar annotation at the beginning. Those are musical instructions. So, O Lord, I've heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Selah means a break. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. Another pause. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked. That ought to sound familiar. Genesis chapter 3. The promise to Eve that her offspring would crush the head of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Another pause. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. I hear and my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones, and my legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. And then, guess what shows up again? Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And then you've got the inscription that this was to the choir master to be played with stringed instruments. So what's basically the content here of Habakkuk's prayer? Habakkuk has had this exchange with God. We've totally understood what he's saying some places, other places it's a little more opaque to us, but where does Habakkuk end? We've got basically kind of one tone from verses 1 through 16, and then kind of a final commitment at 17 through 19. How? God's in charge. And we're not God. He is. He will use that power for his justice. It can't be opposed by anybody. You know, we're concerned about armies. He can level mountains. And doesn't, by the way, have to raise much of a sweat doing it. He made them by his breath, right? So he can, he's got a lot more power than anything that we're currently afraid of. And with that as the basis, then what is Habakkuk's final commitment in 17, 18, and 19?
No matter how bad it gets, there's still hope.
Yep. And before the restoration even happens, I'm going to trust in God. Oh, you said joy? Yeah, rejoicing. Even if the fig tree's not blossoming, which is such a wonderful contrast to, remember, that's how Jonah ended, him pouting about the fig tree that God had put to death. And here we've got the opposite from Habakkuk. And interestingly enough, if we had more time, we'd do a deeper dive. Jonah was pouting because God had saved the people of Nineveh. And Habakkuk is saying, even if my people get wiped out, still I will trust in God. So I think that fig tree keeps showing up unexpectedly as a little reminder and a point of comparison. Even the olive, the fields, the flock being cut off, no herds. Even when everything is flat, even when I'm out, everything in life is zero and nothing has been restored. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. For God the Lord is my strength. And he makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me to tread on my high places. So what I love is, once again, we have an exchange. We had it with Job. We have it here with Habakkuk. Has God actually resolved the problem by Habakkuk chapter 3? Has Habakkuk's, physical setting changed in the least? No. But has God changed Habakkuk's heart and outlook? Yep. When Job makes all of his complaints, now we know at the end of the book of Job, God restores everything. In fact, twice as much as he had allowed Satan to take away in the first place. But Job comes to terms of peace with God before God restores everything. He says, you are God, and in you I will trust. Not on the basis of what you have done, but simply on the basis of who you are. What you've done displays who you are, but that's not the reason I praise you. I praise you for who you are. And that seems to be where Habakkuk lands. And like I said, little bonus as he gets there in three chapters instead of like 42. So there's that too. Any other thoughts here with Habakkuk? This very quick exchange, accusation to God, God's response, Habakkuk, where he lands up. All right. So next week we're going to be doing Zechariah, which is a little bit longer one, so we won't be able to go verse by verse like we did today, but we will get through. Actually, is it? Hang on. No, it's Zephaniah. Yeah, sorry. Zephaniah is short. Zephaniah we get to do verse by verse. Sorry, I've been working ahead, so I sometimes forget where we're at. So yeah, next week will be Zephaniah, so we'll get to do kind of like this again. And then we're going to be barreling toward the end, because now we're into the zebras having zero mothers portion. So that means we're down into the last few books. So thanks, everybody. I hope the Minor Prophet study continues to be helpful for you. If you get a chance, read Zephaniah a handful of times before next week. Be ready with comments about what stands out to you, because there's another just 3 chapters. So let's close with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us safely here today in a warm and lovely place to be, to gather and worship and around your word. Pray that you would continue by that word, which is even surer than the eyewitness testimony or the eyewitness experience of Peter and James and John, that by that word you would continue to strengthen us for the life of faith to which you have called us. We thank you that you are the mighty God that was proclaimed by Habakkuk in Habakkuk 3, and that we still can present to you, just as he did in 1 and 2, our complaints and our concerns, trusting that you hear and that you care and you shall provide for our needs and even perhaps provide us an answer. But in the absence of either of those things, we ask that you would enable us to trust in you for who you are. Thank you for each person here, and ask that as we go forth from this place, you would go with us. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thanks so much, everybody. Lots of